Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. We are going to start. So sorry for the delay. It was the technician were working on the remote participation settings. So please take your seat, and if you can come more close. First, so thanks for everyone for attending this session. My name is Rafik Damak, and for today, we are going to have kind of roundtable to talk about the answerability within the multi-stakeholder model. And we got several speakers, and we will try to cover several areas. And for that, to kind of facilitate this discussion, we have 4 questions. So I will read them, and this is they give guidance in what kind of topic we will cover. So the first question is how international organizations build their constitution, structure, and the process to respond to expectations such as transparency, openness, diversity, inclusion, legitimacy, representation, and accountability. So sorry, there are so many terms there. The second question is how stakeholders, in particular civil society, strategize their participation. What are they using as mechanism and approaches to justify their actions and maintain transparency? The third one, what is the influence of processes and structuring within the organization and stakeholders in terms of agenda setting, issues framing, and yielding outcomes? The last questions, can we envision a set of principles, best practices, mechanism, or even a process template that can be shared between all internet governance organization and processes? So this is really just to kind of make it more easier for the audience and also for the speakers to discuss the issue. And we will start first with Professor Janet Hoffman. And I think maybe she can give us some, maybe from an academic standpoint, what she think about this question, and if she can pick up one of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Rafik. I'm just addressing the first question. That's what we agreed upon, right? That we go question by question. So what I would say about the first question, I think that Rafik sort of formulated the question correctly by asking how are constituencies built. I think that all international organizations have a vital interest in shaping the constituencies that are supposed to hold them to account. So and we can also see this in the kind of wording we find. For example, when ICANN speaks of the ICANN community or the IGF about the multi-stakeholder community, these terms are not value-free. They sort of imply definitions of what is part of, who is part of the community and who is not part of the community. When we speak of the multi-stakeholder process, who is not part of the community are those people who don't believe in that kind of process. So there are values in this terminology, and one of the things that seems to be excluded from the term community is the power relations between those holding an organization or its board to account and those who make the decisions. Community sounds like eye-level relationships, but typically it's not. So what I would say from a civil society point of view is that we should be aware of the kind of terms we use, the wording, and what implications they have. And we should have a critical perspective on that kind of language, particularly with a view to that these terms implicitly define a constituency. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. That was quite concise and straight to the point. So from there we will go with Matthew, and I think he probably will kind of follow up with this, and if you want to elaborate one of those questions. So.
Thanks, Rafiq. Actually, I'll just stick with the first question, if that's the order we're going in, right, rather than, yeah, I think that probably makes more sense. It's a really interesting question, answerability, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we struggle with from a governance perspective when we're talking about the internet ecosystem. None of the structures within the internet ecosystem are traditional structures that we are used to dealing with over hundreds of years, such as the evolution of businesses or international organizations and similar. And that's simply because at the end of the day, we have a very distinct definition change between, or differentiation between, for example, with businesses where we have shareholders and those entities in the internet ecosystem that are stakeholders. And I think that's a significant challenge when it comes to understanding what the accountability and answerability relationships are between those shareholders, stakeholders, and the organizations that they're associated with. And that's an important difference between the two. When it comes to international organizations, there's absolutely no doubt that the organizations themselves are answerable to their members, and their members are governments, and those governments are in turn answerable to the citizens. And that's what makes the interaction between those international organizations and the internet ecosystem organizations so challenging, is because of that difference of association and answerability. And finding the way to mesh those, I think, has been one of those things that we've struggled with, certainly since these issues in the internet ecosystem came to the fore in the WS86 process in 2002 and 2003. And we still haven't answered that adequately. And I still don't think that there is we haven't found yet a comfortable way of assessing and determining the degree to which we need to be answerable to our various stakeholders and who those stakeholders are. As a stakeholder within ICANN, for example, I think it's very difficult for us to know which way our responsibility goes, because as a stakeholder we have an interest in the organization for it to perform, much like a shareholder has an interest in a business for the company to perform financially. At the same time, we have another responsibility, so we have an answerability for our actions vis-a-vis ICANN. We have another answerability issue, which is the other direction, which typical shareholders don't have, which is to our respective broader communities. And that dimension, I think we're pretty clear on the first dimension, what our answerability is to the organization itself, but our answerability to the stakeholders that we represent, I think we're still struggling with. And I think that's one of those things that's very different and makes our ecosystem very different to traditional ecosystems in international organizations or business. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matt. We heard first from maybe from an academia and civil society standpoint, and for now we will move to Jay, who can probably speak for private sector and maybe technical community standpoint.
Sure, thanks, Rafiq. Yeah. So I guess we're going question by question here, which is a little different than my understanding, so bear with me. To kind of piggyback on what Matt was saying, I actually had a very similar view as him in terms of answerability is both an internal and an external perspective, especially when we're talking about ICANN. Internally we need to make sure that ICANN and its members and its stakeholders are actually following through on the bylaw reforms and things like that. And then in a more broad sense, we also need to have make sure that ICANN and the multi-stakeholder model in internet governance is actually kind of meeting the needs of the broader community and people outside of this ecosystem. With that, from kind of a private sector perspective, one of the things that I think about in terms of a multi-stakeholder model is this concept of a B corporation. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with this concept, but it says here that B corporations are used as a business force for good. They're sort of certified by a nonprofit lab that meets rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. They also have a multi-stakeholder model component to how they come up with their they have working groups and bylaws, and it's a very kind of open platform from that perspective. The interesting thing about this to me is that 1,900 companies have signed on to become a B corporation. I think that's probably far exceeds the number of companies that are involved in ICANN or internet governance. So there is definitely other places that we could draw from when we looked on how to answer this question.
Okay, thank Jay. Just to make clear, I mean, as for speakers, they can pick up whatever question they want. So, but maybe continuing in the space for those from the technical community and going to Andres, maybe it's speaking like CCTLD standpoint, and also with your experience with RIR. So if you can respond to one of the questions, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Rafik. I'm not maybe representing the standpoint of the CCTLDs, but I can speak on my behalf, being part of the technical community in several different places the last, I won't say how many years because it doesn't benefit me. So anyway, trying to pick up a little bit about the first question on international organizations, I would say that even if the CCTLDs are not international organizations, because by definition are territorial organizations, so this accountability issue, I believe, is something that falls into the national communities, and I hope it remains that way. But I have to say that the technical community, the regional and the global technical community, they have some challenges on this expectations of transparency and accountability. I believe, I would say, maybe some of you would not agree, but I can say that for me, these organizations, especially ICANN, are in the right path. They have a lot to do yet, and so I won't pick up a lot of discussion on that. I just will leave it in this principle, and I will go to the third question that I believe I can contribute much more. I believe on the influencing processes and the agenda setting, the issues framing, these organizations and stakeholders that have been collectively discussing this for more than 10 years. These forums, these multi-stakeholder processes have been really useful for this agenda setting and issues framing. Global forums, intersessional structured discussions, evolutionized bottom-up processes, regional and national processes that are retroalimentating this global sphere. I believe this is working quite well. The real challenge for me is that to lead this from this stage of evolution to the outcome-oriented processes, to decision-making. My sense until now is that this amount of collective effort, this amount of evolution that I tend to think that we have made, and maybe I contributed a little bit to that, have not yet impacted on the regulatory environments, on the decision-making, on the public policies. Maybe the only happy example I can some of you may not agree also, but I believe the IANA stewardship transition could be a happy example of that, but maybe only an exception, and the rest of the regulatory environments are not influenced in as I believe it will be desirable to have this influence from this collective evolution. I believe that the global communities are, and the regional also, are failing to show, even to the democratic countries, to the democratic governments, that the multi-stakeholder model is not about replacing their role of governments, but to informing their decision-making. And I believe the rest of the challenges are much more in that part. These communities should now try to think collectively how to influence those decision-making processes, and we are not doing that very well. That's my initial take. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andres. So it seemed the focus in the beginning is about the ICANN and maybe IANA stewardship transition, but we may need really to see what happens in other space, and maybe we start first to talk about the trade and. Yes, and we kind of to move to Purkan, so you can give some insight about your experience in that environment and maybe comparing that to other spaces and fora.
Yeah, thank you, Rafik. So I'm going to talk about the TPP because I think there's a story there to tell people, to tell about people's power. So the TPP is that, at least in the US, I know that there are discussions going on in other countries, especially here in Mexico, whether they should ratify. Please don't do that. But in the US, the TPP is that, and there is a misconception out there because people think that Trump killed the TPP. No, that's lie. And I would have picked a different word, but this is Trump here, so I will say that's lie, that's rubbish, that's bullshit, because it's not Trump who killed the TPP. It's the people. It's the power of people who killed the TPP. So I started to work on the TPP 5 years ago when I first joined Public Citizen, and at that time I realized that there is a big, greater like trade coalition. It's cross-sectoral, it's like cross-border, it's movements of movements. And this movement managed to kill the TPP in the US and hopefully in other countries. And we strategized the issues, we picked our fights, you know. Everyone that was a huge coalition of different like civil society organizations representing different interests, but we picked our fights. We picked the technical issues. We work with our governments, we work with our negotiators, we work with our civil society. We approach the journalists and tell the journalists that, look, the TPP is not a good deal for this country because there are all these issues in the TPP. So, and then this year in the US, when we were having the elections, TPP became an election issue. And both Trump and Hillary were against the TPP. And I remember Hillary in 2011 was saying the TPP was gold standard, but she had to say because people in the US were concerned about the TPP. So the civil society has a power, so people have power, and we should be reminded of this power because we are entering into really, really rough times. And I have to say that, like, you know, now maybe we are happy, we killed the TPP, but probably in a couple of years we look back and we would be like, oh, those provisions were so great, like because now the threats that we are facing now are worse than the TPP. So it's time to reunite, you know, come up with big coalitions, pick up our fights, and fight against the corporations, business interests, not necessarily all business interests, but big multinational corporation interests, and this agenda out there, because that agenda out there is not our agenda. It's the big businesses' agenda. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Burcu. So we will continue in discussion here about multilateral space and moving to another example, which is the WIPO. And Michelle Woods from WIPO, maybe you can give an example of something that's relevant.
Thanks, Rafik. I'd be happy to do that. For those who don't know, the World Intellectual Property Organization is a multilateral organization. It's a specialized United Nations agency that addresses, as is the name, intellectual property. But what I wanted to highlight is particularly with the example of the recently adopted Marrakesh Treaty to benefit persons who are blind, visually impaired, and print disabled. There was tremendous stakeholder involvement, and really this treaty started with stakeholders, with the World Blind Union, with civil society groups supporting the idea of having a treaty about limitations and exceptions to copyright to harmonize those limitations and exceptions in order to provide access to published works for persons in this category who wouldn't otherwise be able to receive access without having to get permission from rights holders. And the copyright system does include the concept of these exceptions, but this is the first treaty we've had that has been focused on those exceptions and also that seeks to harmonize them across borders and to add a cross-border transfer element. So all of that was unique, and really the motivation for this was what we call our NGOs, which is really any stakeholders that are not governments or IGOs. And there was active participation throughout all steps of the negotiation process, including at the diplomatic conference. And this has been pointed out by some civil society commentators as a real gold standard for what could actually happen in multilateral organizations to bring elements of multi-stakeholder principles into the process. We also have a system with our traditional knowledge discussion that's going on about potentially adopting treaties in this area, where there are panels, for example, of indigenous peoples who are funded to come to the meeting, where we have specific consultations with indigenous persons as part of the meetings, and where there's really a very active effort to bring those stakeholders into the process. I would say that it is important that there be some members, when you're made up of member states, that are supportive of these initiatives. For example, for the Marrakesh Treaty to actually get on the agenda of the Standing Committee on Copyright, member states actually had to be the proponents. So the treaty text was actually initially prepared mainly by stakeholders with some participation by some government representatives, but some government representatives had to come forward and basically be willing to put that proposal forward. So there does have to be some support, but generally speaking, we have found that there is strong support from at least some elements of the government representatives to include stakeholders in the process. On the Marrakesh Treaty, the other aspect I wanted to very quickly bring up is that what we've done within WIPO is to form a multi-stakeholder platform, but also a multi-stakeholder group to implement the Marrakesh Treaty. This is called the Accessible Books Consortium, and it has membership from across all of the different stakeholders, including representatives of organizations that help or are made up of persons who are blind, visually impaired, and print disabled, libraries that provide services to these entities, publishers, authors, and basically all the different groups that are involved in trying to implement the treaty. WIPO does provide basically a secretariat role, but other than that, the work of this consortium is really driven by the stakeholders. And so that's an area where we've been able to bring in a multi-stakeholder entity that has been built within the organization in order to carry forward some of the work that was basically started by groups of stakeholders.
Thanks, Michelle. And I see that Burko, I think you want to intervene here.
Because, thank you, Michelle, for mentioning the Marrakesh Treaty, because Marrakesh Treaty it's a success story for us. Like, as intellectual property community, we've been like fighting all those years in different venues, in the WTO, in WIPO, in FTAs, because there is this like a very progressive agenda from the corporations and from the developed countries against developing countries. So, and Marrakesh Treaty change, it was a start of an era, because for the first time we had a very proactive, progressive like agenda, and we pushed for that. And the stakeholders, the Union of Blinds, and some of the other civil society members, they pushed really hard for the Marrakesh Treaty. And it's a success story, and it's out there, and there are lots of lessons to be drawn from the Marrakesh Treaty. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Burko. Moving now to another space, which is the cybersecurity, and I think Tatiana want to maybe elaborate some points here.
Thank you, Rafik. Tatiana Tropina, Max Planck Institute, Germany. I was struggling when I saw 4 of your questions, and I was even a bit struggling when I saw the title of the session, because if we are speaking about cybersecurity, and I'm working in cybersecurity field, reality and answerability get completely different dimension, and sometimes that I think that to actually figure out answerability, we have to see the reality first. Well, first of all, if we are talking about cyber security spaces, there are so many of them, and many of them are still closed, even if there is a conventional wisdom already for like a decade at least, that cybersecurity should be multi-stakeholder. But if we are talking about multi-stakeholder approaches, how do we strategize, how do we build these models? I would say that it is mostly ad hoc. And in many cases, it's just top-down. When some governments want to open fora on the national level, when some international fora are getting open, like, for example, a global conference on cyberspace, London process. But it is just a goodwill in many cases. And I think that we have to accept the reality that all these closed and not inclusive fora will coexist with some more flexible multi-stakeholder model. Where this multi-stakeholder model is coming from? Well, I believe that for some cases, it's just natural. When you think about cybersecurity, you have to understand that there are different dimensions and different domains of these. Some of them will be closed and multilateral, like, for example, national security, like foreign policy, like diplomacy. Some of them will be naturally more open, but probably not for civil society, less for academia, like, for example, critical information infrastructure protection. They include businesses by default, but civil society voices are not that heard still yet. What is interesting, what is getting multi-stakeholder is actually the strategy making of how to open this fora. And I do see how law enforcement, governments, academia, civil society are coming together, and we are still talking how to work together, how to make this fora open. But I believe that, and I say it again, we have to accept the reality. Some of the processes will be multilateral. There are some sensitive issues. There are some absolutely natural limitations for multi-stakeholder models in cybersecurity. And the last issue I want to cover is this dichotomy, legitimacy, transparency. In cybersecurity, it goes vice versa. Legitimacy doesn't always mean transparency. They can be mutually exclusive. Legitimate models doesn't always mean inclusion. Legitimate models doesn't always mean openness, especially if it's about government, if it's about some of the political regimes. So to be legitimate in this cybersecurity fora, you don't always need to be open, and this is just harsh reality we are facing now. And of course, we are working on making all these spaces more open, but I believe that the first priority would be for multi-stakeholder cooperation, for multi-stakeholder decision-making is just to focus on those venues which we can get open and where we can cooperate, and just accept that some of them will not. And the last thing, even if they are getting open, it is interesting because I took part in some of them which were closed, which were exclusive. Even if they open it for you because you are academia, because you are writing reports for them, or you are a part of their decision making before it comes to the real decision, then you get a seat somewhere in the corner, and even bringing you up front on the table might get a lot of political controversy if you're not anywhere from the government. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tatiana. I guess we can take another round of intervention from the speakers. Janet, do you want to? Yes.
Yes, I think the cybersecurity example should make us question the sort of scope of the multi-stakeholder model. I often have the suspicion that multi-stakeholder approaches are celebrated in area where it doesn't count, either because there are no decisions being made or the decisions are not really relevant. So that is one point. But I also wanted to say something in response to Matt, who talked about representativeness of civil society. I think we have a real misunderstanding here. The whole idea, the notion of representativeness goes back to people who make binding decisions on our behalf. Civil society does not make binding decisions on anybody's behalf. And to sort of apply that concept, that core concept of accountability to civil society sort of seems to take the carpet away under our feet because it makes a weak stakeholder even weaker. How often have I heard that? Who are you responsible to? I'm an individual. I'm not speaking on anybody's behalf, but I also never claimed that I'm representative. And I think civil society as such is such a diverse community. It cannot even agree on sort of single positions in many cases. How can these groups then be responsible or sort of representative of anybody? I think it's the wrong concept.
Okay, thanks. So I see. Okay, so I think Matt, Tatiana, and we will go with Steve and the gentleman here. So Matt, please.
Thanks, Jeanette. I clearly wasn't communicating correctly. I don't think I really ever implied that, and certainly don't believe that's the case. However, I would say that if we are talking about stakeholders do, in the sense that they are representative, have an answerability to some other stakeholders that they represent. So I think we have to be careful here about whether we're talking about civil society as a community or civil society as some stakeholder entity acting within a construct, and I think that's a slight difference thing. About the multi-stakeholder model. About the multi-stakeholder model. It's a great model. It does work. Some of us have sat through 2 years of the CCWG IANA and CCWG accountability, and it works. We have fundamentally changed the governance structure of a very unique organization at the core of the internet ecosystem, and we've facilitated a government to step back from its role in the DNS. That's a pretty substantial and real impact multi-stakeholder engagement. Now, where has it happened elsewhere? And I think this is the interesting thing about the question about multi-stakeholder model. Where has it happened elsewhere to the same degree? And why was it successful in this particular construct at ICANN? And how can we take that, the learnings from that construct, and apply them elsewhere? Because what we haven't got to date is a very good other examples that we can point to that have had that kind of an impact. And I think we really need to learn from the ICANN experience and say, what did it take? What were the parameters? What were the requirements? How effective was the chartering up front and things like that? Those are all key factors when it comes to seeing a success of the multi-stakeholder model. The other thing I would say is we need to stop kidding ourselves. The multi-stakeholder model is new. I mean, yes, okay, in internet time it's not new. But compared to other constructs, it's new. So we're inevitably going to be struggling with this as we go forward. And I think that's, we need to, and the other thing I would say is we overemphasize the expectations of the multi-stakeholder model. It's a governance model. It's going to have its failings. It's going to have its limitations. We shouldn't think of it as some kind of panacea to governance. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. We will go with Steve. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. To the extent that multi-stakeholder is deemed effective or works is often a function of what organization it's in. ICANN, for example, was born with an operational role of publishing the root and distributing numbers. That operational role gave it, well, a little bit of credibility, a little legitimacy, but mostly it made it important enough that civil society, business, and technical community would show up because they knew that it mattered, that their voices would matter. IETF is another multi-stakeholder group that we'll deem as effective. I don't know whether civil society perceives that its presence there is effectively represented, but W3C, and groups that actually publish things that matter, like a root table, right? Groups that publish standards that are then implemented. Those will be multi-stakeholder candidates that have an opportunity to be far more effective than a multi-stakeholder group that doesn't make decisions. However, IGF, as a multi-stakeholder gathering, is seen as highly effective at generating conversations, sharing of ideas and best practices and concerns that need to be addressed. If that's its full output, I can measure that as effective. There are some who wish it made decisions as well, and they will deem it as ineffective. And now, Jeanette, if I could turn to your question about downward accountability. There are instances where civil society is given, in the charter of an organization, it's given an explicit role with a vote. And ICANN is a great example of this. On the non-commercial stakeholders group is civil society representing itself and having the ability to make decisions that absolutely matter in what policies are approved and put forth and policies that end up being implemented in the domain name system. And in that instance, the charter describes who are the civil society bodies that have that decisional role. And I think that Matthew Shears is right. It behooves us to ask whether those civil society groups, as well as business groups and others, that are chartered, are they actually representing the interests or entities that they were chartered to represent? And it's a fair question. It's one of the workstream 2 items that Matthew Shears, Farsi, and I are working on right now at ICANN is asking the question, is it open to all the participants of those entities you were supposed to represent? And if they want to join, do they find it accessible, affordable? Can they figure out how to get in? Is there an eligibility criteria? Are the decisions that are made challengeable by a neutral third party? Are there fair and open elections for officers? And how are decisions reached when NCSG or BC decides it's time to cast our vote on a policy? And those are all legitimate questions to ask as to whether we are answerable to the communities that we were designed to serve. It wouldn't apply to every civil society organization, but it's certainly an askable question for civil society organizations that participate in multi-stakeholder groups where they have a decisional role.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Tim?
Thanks. I actually agree with you. Regarding the relevancy of the multi-stakeholder model, I'm actually torn apart. I think that the fact that it doesn't work in cybersecurity in many spaces is just because it has a long history of other dynamics. It wasn't born multi-stakeholder. It has the history of power, of government responsibility for protecting its citizens. It's a mix of different responsibilities, and it's not sometimes about answerability, it's about power. And also, I believe that in cybersecurity, the conventional wisdom of the necessity of inclusion of different stakeholders in different processes, it just doesn't work, because if you think cybersecurity consists of so many facets, like policy making, like lawmaking, like processes of actual provision of technical cybersecurity, and also enforcement. And if I have a look at the relevancy of multi-stakeholder model on this different level, I would say that the most relevant would be policy making. Because when we come to lawmaking, I would say that it can be multi-stakeholder only to a certain extent, because it would be anyway the responsibility of the legislature and not of different stakeholders. When we come to the actual operational level, but for example, critical information infrastructure protection, it can be multi-stakeholder, but it would be mostly governmental and business. And when we come to enforcement, I'm sorry, I don't want enforcement to be multi-stakeholder. And I believe that there is a big confusion when we say multi-stakeholder cybersecurity. Let's be clear what we are talking about.
Okay, thanks, Tatiana. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrei Sherbovich, National Research University, Higher School of Economics, Moscow, Russia. I belong to academia, this kind of stakeholder group. And I think that just a couple of words about this. The internet is one of the most complex system we need to govern, so that I believe that multi-stakeholderism is the best model for governance, because no stakeholder group for itself, even the governmental or intergovernmental, could be responsible for the internet governance. I think I have to watch the picture. It's Indian-like, but it's for the blind man and the elephant. So each blind man could respond that the elephant is the same thing. Only the different groups could understand what it is and how to deal with this. So that I'm strong support of any kind of multi-stakeholderism, and to engage all stakeholder groups to participate. I have only the question, what is the role of academia, and could the academia be recognized as a separate stakeholder group? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I see a queue getting shaped, so I ensure that I'm taking note. And I think, Jan, you want to...
Oh, yeah, thanks. Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, Jan Scholte, University of Gothenburg. Just this issue about representation, which Jeanette did. No, it's a really important question, and it's. I just wanted to bring a bit of, perhaps a little bit of nuance into it, because what often happens is that people either say, "You're representative, you've got to be accountable in all the ways, like a parliamentary, etc." But no, we're civil society. We're not representative in that way. Therefore, we don't have accountability. That becomes one extreme. Or on the other extreme, you have people say, oh, you're claiming to represent people, therefore you should be as accountable as and in the same ways and to the same extent as parliamentarians and the like. And then it gets put into those two extremes. And I'm not sure that that's really the best way to think about it. I mean, representation has different dimensions, and civil society groups, I think, represent in a variety of different ways. So sometimes, as Steve says, there is actual representation in the sense of having a mandate, a formal mandate to take decisions. And at that point, you are representing. You've been given a mandate by a particular constituency, and you're answerable to that constituency, and maybe even wider, for the decisions that you take. But there are lots of other times when civil society groups will speak as, not speak for, but speak as. So many times civil society groups will get into this kind of forum, and they will say, as a Russian, or as a woman, or as a disabled person, therefore I have this insight. And that's representing, also speaking as rather than speaking for. And when you do that, you're also making claims. And you're saying, I have a special position, which gives me a special insight, and therefore I have a right to make a certain impact on the discussion. Well, arguably, maybe you don't have the same kind of accountability to the extent of having a formal position, but you're still making claims which could then have consequences. You might also speak about. You come in and speak about people. How many groups would come in and speak about people who then are not in the room and don't have a chance to represent themselves directly in the room, but people are speaking about them? That can also have huge consequences. And then you might also speak with. I spoke with the business community, therefore. I spoke with the peasants, therefore. And that's also making claims of representation. Anyway, it's just I'm going around the houses a little bit, but just to say, I think one can unpack different kinds of representation. And when people do get in the room as civil society people, they do have better access, they do have better resources, they do have better possibilities to affect the process. And they make various representative claims when they do that. And I think when they make those representative claims, with that does come accountability, especially in the case of formal mandate, but to a certain extent in other cases too.
Okay, thanks. We'll go with Wolfgang. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As Matt has said, we are in the early days of a political invention, which was born just, 1 or 1.5 decades ago. I would agree more with Matt and Steve and disagree with Jeanette if it comes to all these questions which summarized by Jan. I want to give you a practical example. Certainly, if Jeanette speaks on her behalf as an individual, she says, I do not represent anybody and I do not want to be accountable to anybody. That's okay. If Annette Mühlberg, also a German lady, who was the former chair of the At-Large Advisory Committee, and she's a member of the German trade union Verdi, with 150,000 members. If she speaks on behalf of the trade union as a civil society organization, then she is certainly accountable to the 150,000 members of this trade union. And if she speaks, she has a certain legitimacy and to bring a perspective. So certainly Annette can speak as an individual as well. But this is a difference. And I think because this is such a big picture with so many different animals, I have compared this very often with the rainforest. So we have no overview, how many animals and plants are there. So this is what we have to learn, how to live with this and how to structure it. And insofar, the Jana transition process is an incredible source of knowledge now and experiences that you can say how you can manage in a certain way this rainforest-like processes. So far, I see we have 3 big results which are already on the table from a multi-stakeholder process. The definition of internet governance was produced in a really multi-stakeholder process. The WCAG was a multi-stakeholder body where governments had no priority for the non-governmental members. It was, at the end of the day, rubber stamped by the governments,
But the Internet governance definition from 2005 is a result of a multi-stakeholder process. The Net Mundial principles, the 8 principles we have from Sao Paulo from 2014, is the result of a multi-stakeholder process, and this is an achievement. And now we have a new mechanism and the accountability system from the IANA transition. So that means we have a definition, we have a framework of principles, and we have a mechanism, accountable mechanism, and some other checks and balances in the system. So this is for the 21st century, for the first 16 years of the 21st century, already a lot. So more has to be done. And if we have this perspective and do not expect already the solution of the problem tomorrow or until the year 2020, so if we have this more, let's say, Chinese way of looking, until the end of the century, then probably we can be more effective and saying, okay, this has to be done step by step to move forward slowly. And if I have the word, let me also respond to the second issue with the usability of the multi-stakeholder model for other areas like security, trade, and things like that. And here I also go back to the definition of the WCAG definition, because it was the mandate of the WCAG to define what Internet governance is, because nobody had a definition. And we had a discussion between a narrow definition and a broad definition. So, and at the end of the day, the outcome from the WCAG was Internet governance is more than names and numbers. Internet governance is much more than ICANN. And we have in the final part of the definition, there is, this is relevant for the evolution and the use of the Internet. Bertrand de la Chapelle always differentiate between the governance of the Internet and the governance on the Internet. I think all what we have discussed with the IANA transition is the evolution of the Internet, is governance of the Internet. So, but governance on the Internet, this is the challenge ahead of us. And what I see is now that in particular governments, and I think Tatjana has made a good point here, recognize that their traditional domains like security and economy is now infiltrated by the Internet, but they do not link it to Internet governance. Security people speak about cyber war, cyber weapons, and all this, but it has nothing to do with Internet governance. This is just cyber. Already the language makes the difference clear. This is cyber. Business people and also in the governments, they speak about the digital economy. So Germany has now the chairmanship of the G20, and they have adopted in Hangzhou a huge document on the digital economy, and there is one paragraph which says G20 countries support Internet governance, a multi-stakeholder model for Internet governance. But in their understanding, here's the digital economy, and then we have one small point. This Internet governance has nothing to do with the digital economy, and this is wrong. So the core of cyber and the core of digital economy is more or less is based on Internet governance. And this is a misunderstanding among a lot of governments that they say, yeah, multi-stakeholder model is good for Internet governance, for names and numbers. That means they still live in the narrow definition and have not accepted the broad definition that all this is infiltrated. But again, we have still 84 years to go in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Yes, Birgit?
And I want to comment. Thank you very much for your comments. So I want to talk about the trade and the multi-stakeholderism in trade, because there is nothing like multi-stakeholderism in the trade. And I heard a couple of times the United States Trade Representative negotiators talking about multi-stakeholderism, and I warned them, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Don't use the word multi-stakeholderism, because multi-stakeholderism doesn't work in the trade. It ends the minute you realize that the other stakeholder has millions of dollars to invest in lobbying. When we look at the TPP and other trade agreements, the U.S. is part of. The tax is tabled by the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, and the USTR has 600 corporate corporate lobbyist advisors. So they shape the tax. And here we talk about ICANN, we talk about multi-stakeholderism, we talk about domain names, but there are provisions in the TPP about domain names. And now I'm going to ask, I want to ask the ICANN people here, have they consulted you, or have they consulted the civil society or businesses like who've been doing this ICANN work and working on domain name system? I'm wondering whether the US or the other country negotiators have approached you and asked, like, hey, we are trying to make rules for the internet, for the domain names, and this is the position we take. What do you think about that? No? No? Like, so you discuss, yeah.
If you'd like an answer from the standpoint of the business community, you don't wait until the negotiations are underway to make your points known. The business community showed up in force with the Commerce Department in charge of the negotiating and let its opinion be known with respect to what kind of domain takedown language would or would not be included. And guess what? The business community was not of one mind. There were business community representatives who had very different views, just as there are civil society groups who don't always agree. And those views were all taken on board, and something of a compromise then emerged in the final language. There wasn't a formal consultation after the final language, because the time to get your licks in is before the language is written.
Yeah, so, but how about the civil society? Like, no?
Okay, yeah, I mean, okay, we have a queue, guys, and I know that people want to intervene, so we can come back to your question later, Broku. So, Michelle?
Well, to be honest, I think we've a bit past the point I was going to make. I was just thinking about this representation question, and there are different aspects of it, as has been pointed out by many people, but one example we had where we really had to make a change, and when I say we, it's not the organization, but the group that was part of the multi-stakeholder group is in this group that's working on implementing the Marrakesh Treaty at WIPO, the Accessible Books Consortium. It became clear that there wasn't enough representation of the beneficiaries, so organizations that represent blind persons, those persons themselves, or organizations that work closely with them and advocate their interests. And so the group itself had to think about basically, if one came down to a vote, normally the group doesn't vote, but if it does, what would the respective representation be of different interests there, and then decided as a group that really more spaces had to be allocated to the primary beneficiaries of the treaty. And so that was something that was decided by a multi-stakeholder group. But there, it's clear when entities join this organization that they are coming in some kind of representative capacity. It doesn't mean that individuals can't also express their views based on their experience, but there is a clear representational mandate. That may be different from civil society organizations that, for example, come to our standing committee meetings on copyright and express views in a context where they are not designated as representatives of a certain community, and then everyone would expect that there would be much more freedom to express views either as individuals or on behalf of that group without having to think about being accountable to a larger group or some kind of other entity that's behind the scenes. So you can really have both of these concepts depending on the context. Thanks.
This work? Okay. This is Milton Mueller. I'm the Internet Governance Project at Georgia Tech, and I want to address the cybersecurity relationship here. I think if you listened very carefully to what Tatiana said, I think you got a very reasonable and correct position on the relationship between multi-stakeholderism and cybersecurity, but there's also a lot of sort of rhetorical overtones which I see accepted by this group that you know, oh, when you're dealing with security, suddenly you're in the land of states, right? And we at the Internet Governance Project are going about to challenge that directly, head-on, specifically, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about multi-stakeholders, and we put too much emphasis on the multi, and we forget about why it's even relevant to include additional stakeholders other than states. The reason you have to do that in the international context is because you have policy decisions, and she's right, it's really only in policy formation that multi-stakeholderism is most relevant. But you have to do that in the transnational context because you have a transnational system that requires transnationally effective policy decisions to be made, and states are fragmented into these territorial jurisdictions, which makes them fundamentally incapable of making those decisions in a way that advances the public interest. Because states represent specific interests. They represent, in particular, their own interests as a military and political entity, and the security of a nation state is not the same as the security of the internet and the users of the internet as a whole. And the interests of the users of the internet as a whole are not conjoined with the sum of the interests of individual nation-state polities. So the reason you need to go multi-stakeholder more in cybersecurity is because you need to have the interests of the internet as a whole represented, and that can't happen through multilateral or state-based systems. You have to include the technical community, you have to include academics, you have to include civil society.
You want to make, should be please, quick interventions.
I can address it very briefly. I think that based on what you told, I totally believe these fora will be open sooner or later. But right now, the only way to make them a kind of at least channeling multi-stakeholder model is just to create it on the national level. So governments who are coming to these closed fora, like global group of experts, like all these, they will at least bring the opinions of their civil society in their nation states, of the technical community. And this is the only one way I see right now. But this is just the first step. And I completely agree with you that they are going to get open. But we also have to understand that policy making is the most relevant in this sense. And I sense that there is the fear that opening the multi-stakeholder will make negotiation process, which take ages in any case on that level, even longer, even more complex, even more complicated. And I think this is one of the reasons why they tend to be more exclusive.
It's really hard to react to everyone here, but I will just I chose Wolfram and he left. So I of course agree with what Matthew said and what Steve Bianco also said about the model, and I'm trying to go back to the first question on what are the principles that we can agree, and I was having trouble myself to answer that question, and I found out that I don't see any one of you trying to answer that, or at least having a concrete approach on what is the thing that we agreed on, that we all agreed. Maybe Wolfgang said in a very structured way that we have a definition and we have then processes, a set of principles, and then now we have one operative example with the transition. But I'm finding hard trouble on understanding if this is something, even the Net Mundial principles that everyone are sharing as principles or as values. I even don't know until which extent this is something that is being accepted in Latin America or something that is being like widespread in my region. And one example could be interesting. The trade example is something that even coming back to the question Burko raised on trade. The TPP in our region, I work closely with the CCTLDs of our region, and 4 of them are part of the TPP. I don't know if now they are, but used to be. And there were a lot of discussions, but they're not even that they have a strong relationship with government and the community. They couldn't do a lot of, that was part of what I was referring at the beginning, that they weren't as influential as at least I expect they should be in that part, even in the weak side of the treaty. Because, but then I realized that even Steve explained that not even the private sector of the strong side of the treaty are as influential as they would like to be or as organized as. So I really believe that in trade, the multi-stakeholder model is not as influential as I believe it should be. So that evolution, that part is, I think, some of the challenges that this model has to evolve, to be as evolved, to be able to influence those processes. And I hope in the next treaty, in the next wave, it's much better than this one. TPP, at least in my region, the technical community wasn't comfortable at all with that outcome. So it's good that it's healed.
So I've been waiting in queue for a little while, so I might backtrack a little bit. I just actually want to go back to Jeanette and the notion that civil society, you're not really accountable to anybody because you're not an elected representative or appointed. I think in the multi-stakeholder model, having representative power is fundamentally different than that power in a government. Government, you are obviously elected or appointed. You represent a certain group of people. Specifically at ICANN and other internet governance forums, you're coming willingly. I participate here willingly, but at the same time, I represent the I2 coalition. So I'm answerable to them. I'm on the BC. I'm answerable to the BC. So if I start spouting off things that are totally inconsistent with our mission, that they're going to have a tough conversation with me. And then, I also represent the interests of the broader business community and the way it interacts with the internet domain name space. And so, it seems naive for me that you're saying that, civil society doesn't really have a representative role in the multi-stakeholder model, because you do. And there's a lot of different, constituency groups that the civil society can participate in, and when you do that, you adopt those kind of responsibilities of those groups. Now moving on, Michelle, I would really thank you for your example of using the Accessible Books Consortium as kind of another use case for the multi-stakeholder model. But even in that instance, and certainly in a B corporation, largely maybe it's multi-stakeholder model, but it's largely driven through a top-down process. So I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that when WIPO said they're going to put together the Accessible Books Consortium, they kind of went out and cherry-picked people that they thought would put together a reasonably functional panel and group of people. And again, ICANN and internet governance in general is very different than that. Steve has mentioned, certainly in the business community, there's a huge variety of viewpoints around policy matters that we put our views out on. As ICANN gets more and more diverse, which I hope it will, because, by the way, in Hyderabad, only 3% of the participants were from Africa and only 3% were from Latin America, so that's definitely something that needs to get worked on. But as we get more and more diverse, people are going to have to become actually more and more answerable to the organizations they represent or the constituency groups that they participate in.
Okay, thanks. Just in terms of transparency, I'm really checking everyone in the queue, so I ensure that you will speak at some level. So, by chance, Janet, you are just after Jay, so maybe you can respond to him. Yeah, Janet? Yeah.
2 points, or 3. First of all, when I speak as a woman, I do not represent women. That would be just preposterous. So if we think that when I speak as a woman, I represent women, then we stretch the concept to a degree that it becomes, in my mind, really meaningless. It's an unfounded claim to authority. So when we say we speak on behalf, it's always a claim to some degree. it is a claim, and we seem to want to make our voice stronger, more powerful, give it more weight. And I think we need to take that into account. It's different when there is a constituency such as the NCUC and they delegate decision-making power to one person. This person is then answerable to the constituency. So in organizations there is representation, but without clear constituencies where we know who the members are and how the relationship between the members is, outside of that, to speak of the same type of representation, I find problematic. So that's my first point. And the second point concerns the age of the multi-stakeholder process. The literature on multi-stakeholder processes says that the first international organization is the ILO, the International Labour Organization, that was founded in 1919. They did not use that term, but the idea of getting various constituencies together and hope that they make better decisions because there is more diversity, that is really old. There was also a period, at least in Europe, where we talked about corporatism that sort of pursued the same idea, to have employers, unions, and other parties come together and make decisions. So as such, the idea is not new, but what is new is the term multi-stakeholder. That was introduced, as Marcus knows, he wrote about it, in 2005 into the internet governance space. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, please.
Okay, here. Thanks, and well, my name is Marcela Paiva, and I'm from the Chilean government. I work in the mission of Chile to WTO and WIPO, and it's my first time in the IGF, so it's very interesting for me to be here, especially in this conversation. First of all, I would like to thank Michelle, because I actually work very closely with her and second all what she has said here, and share what we do in WIPO, and there is definitely a very strong participation of interested observers, not only watching the plenary of what the countries do, but also, even as she pointed out, in the specific process of traditional knowledge negotiations, in informal setting that normally it's closed for observers, we have indigenous participants there debating the issues in the same footing as governments. So I just wanted to make that point, but I'm interested in knowing, in terms of concrete ways and the reality of the answerability of multi-stakeholder model in areas that were not born as in a multi-stakeholder setting. And here I'm speaking on my own behalf, and I hope that that's not a problem, that I'm representing only myself and not necessarily my government, but I'm really trying to think out of the box and see how these could be implemented in a realistic way. Considering we have democracies, and I would assume that this is also gives some level of representation to governments to agree on certain things. And then we, at least in Chile, I know that there's been a lot of interest in trying to pursue more transparency, more participation, particularly in trade issues, that is the area that I'm more knowledgeable on. So, and especially hearing all this issue about representation and thinking in practical terms, how more multi-stakeholderism could be included in the process, realistically. How could a government administer this situation? How could this be included in processes that were not originated in this way at the beginning? This is just a question for anyone that wants to comment, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good morning to all. This is Mourad from Algeria. I'm also from the government of Algeria. I'm a MAG member also. I would like to raise an issue that hasn't been invoked in this workshop, which is how to promote and improve transparency, accountability of the civil society organizations involved in IG. In relation with, and how to safeguard their independence vis-à-vis powerful big internet companies. in issues related to agenda setting and decision-making processes. My second comment also is related to how these organizations could learn and benefit from the experience gained by other similar organizations engaged in, for example, the issue related to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure who maybe want to respond to that, but okay. In the queue, we have now Jan. Yeah, this.
Is this thing working? Yeah. I'm not sure if it was in the queue. No, just again on this representation issue. It's not the same kind of representation. It's not the same kind of representation, but there are representational claims being made. Many people do often say, as a woman, as a peasant, in fora like this. They do. We may contest those, but they are making claims. And our contesting of those claims is actually our trying to call them to account. It's actually an accountability. But so I think we just need to be thinking about new kinds of ways to deal with those claims. Many civil society groups come into the fora like this and make public interest claims. We represent the public interest. And I might be on their side, but I would like to know through what processes of transparency, consultation, evaluation, and correction when they make mistakes, that claim to public interest representation is made. That's all. It's just trying to think about how we can deal with those things. Oh, yes, we do. We elect them and throw them out.
Okay. Okay, guys, I understand the representation issue. It's quite controversial. Marcus? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Interesting discussion. As Jeanette referred to me, I thought I'd come back on that. And she is, of course, perfectly right with the ILO and corporatism and all that. But I think the basic difference between what we now call multi-stakeholderism is that is what we are doing here. We sit around the table as equals. Whereas the ILO, the stakeholders are in silos and they don't really sit around the table and discuss the same issues. They discuss it among themselves and bring it together later. And that's, also, corporatism is yet again another variety, but I think what we refer to as multi-stakeholderism is very much what we practice here in the IGF. Interesting also that ICANN didn't use the term multi-stakeholderism. They used to say private sector-led organization. And ICANN was also built in silos. The stakeholders met in silos. And also this is still, the policy development process is still done that way. What was really true multi-stakeholderism was the IANA transition process, the CCWG. That was really a process where all stakeholders sat around the table as equals and came up with an outcome. So it may sound arcane, but I think it's a distinction worthwhile making and taking note of. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Andres, I think you want to tell something?
Thank you very much, Rafik. It's not reacting to anyone, just a general comment. I'm really glad to be part of this discussion. Maybe in the future I would like to. It's not a criticism. It was really balanced and well-structured panel, but I would like to see more opinions or takes from people from Eastern countries or Eastern communities. I believe there's less chance to have some general views or consensus or agreements with more diversity in this type of discussions. But apart from that, I'm really glad to be part of this discussion.
Thanks, Andres. That's a fair comment. I mean, it's always in terms of organizing workshop, it's kind of it's complicated how to ensure diversity as by the requirement of the MAG, but and also the diversity of point of view that maybe we tend to forget. Anyway, that point is taken. For some reason, we don't have anybody in the queue, but if you know, if you want to intervene, or maybe it can be good. Oh, Janet, then after we can,
Yeah,
then
I think that Matt asked the right question. What are the conditions for multi-stakeholder cooperation within an organization? I have heard all of you talking about this, how how satisfying and really great the collaboration was. And perhaps I should then give the question back to yourself. What do you think were the conditions for working together in that way? Was it the common enemy? Was it the fear that the US government or anybody could sort of undermine that process? Was that one of the conditions that made you stick together and work in that way?
As one of the leaders in the CCWG, Steve Del Bianco, I would say it had a couple of critical ingredients that are actually hard to capture in all cases. One was the sense that it mattered, that this was our one chance to use the leverage of the transition to get accountability from the corporation called ICANN that we never had before. So it mattered. The second was that it had a time frame. There was a sense of urgency with respect to the date of 2015, which then was moved to 2016, a date that was dictated by political considerations, not contract termination. So it mattered, it had a time urgency, and then the third criteria was that we found ourselves with a bottom-up process. We asked for the process. ICANN did not want to look at accountability at all. They wanted a short, sweet little transition of the IANA functions. But we, the community, at the London meeting, went to the microphone together, civil society and business side by side, and governments alongside too, saying we are going to call time out here. And until we come back with a plan for accountability, this transition is not going forward. So those three ingredients helped to make it a process that was worth enduring. And I wish it was as simple as Matt described it, a lot of meetings. There were phone calls, and we rotated time zones around the planet. We wrote thousands of pages and worked hard to struggle through consensus that would come completely unraveled on the next call when new people joined in. It was a very painful process. The product was not by any means perfect, but it is a vast improvement on what we had before and a vast improvement on what we would have had the community not come together in London and asked for it.
Thanks, Steve, but I think at the end there was a kumbaya moment with all stakeholders. Okay, yes, Matt.
Well, Steve's captured it wonderfully. What I think was really interesting, though, was there are all those factors that are important. Another factor that's really important that's quite unique to ICANN is this notion of chartering and agreeing a set of principles and parameters up front, and that also lends itself very well to the success of the process. What I will say, though, is, and we don't want to underestimate this wasn't easy sailing. Many individuals and many different stakeholder groups and subsections of those stakeholder groups came to this process with very different ideas. I know I came into this process with a very different idea than where we ended up. But I think what happened over time, and again, I don't want to trivialize this, is that by being forced to work together because of what the conditions that Steve said, we built, whether we liked it or not, that ability to actually discuss and agree and argue in a way that was constructive rather than arguing in a way that was not constructive. And that was one of the big differences. You can trivialize it by saying it was trust. It may not have been trust in the real sense of the word trust, but it was a willingness to work together towards a common goal. And it was a common goal that finally came about through spending a good amount of time just feeling our way around each other and where we were coming from in the beginning. So I think that's an important factor as well.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I think we are going to really reach the end, maybe a few minutes remaining in the workshop, trying to wrap up. I'm not sure that we answered all of the question, but at least I see there are several issues raised, like about the representativity and maybe so learning about other experience in terms of multi-stakeholder model. I was hoping that if we can maybe just to highlight some principles and also think about how to operationalize the model, but it sounds that maybe it's not easy to do. However, I think it can remain a goal to reach. So since we have a few minutes, just if the speakers, they want kind of to make like a last statement, just maybe to summarize or their thought, or maybe the way to move forward from here. Michelle? Yeah. Sorry for the
So, well, I can't say I have an answer to that question. I'm sorry. I'm kind of thinking about it as we go along here, and also thinking back to Marcela's question about what do you do for organizations that didn't start out espousing these multi-stakeholder principles or the prior versions before that name was given. But I do think that the goal of trying to distill some principles and provide some kind of, I guess it would be a document, but some kind of set of guidelines for entities that have very good will and would like to bring components of this horrible word multi-stakeholderism into their organizations, how they could do that. And that might be a series of case studies, and it might be also some sets of principles thinking about how you make sure that you bring in all of the different stakeholder groups that ought to be a part, because that can be an initial question. And then how you structure, for example, meetings or other situations in which issues are discussed in order to make sure that it truly is what was mentioned by a couple of the speakers, coming together as equals to have the discussion, because that may not have been the original forum that was adopted by many entities. Those might be some elements one could think about as sort of subjects of at least one of the components of a set of objectives, of a set of principles, accompanied, I think, because I do think, for example, for the organization I work for, that case studies looking at models of what other organizations did is really most of the time the way this kind of change would come about. We say, oh, so-and-so tried that, it worked well for them, let's see if we can give this a try. Sometimes that's brought in by governments, sometimes that's brought in at the international organization or UN level, sometimes it's suggested by civil society groups. But those are a few thoughts. Sorry, I can't give a complete answer, but maybe it's a start.
Thanks, Michelle.
So, in terms of setting up, I guess, a set of principles or best practices that could be adopted by other multi-stakeholder organizations, I think we face a number of challenges on a number of different fronts. One of them is just from a timing perspective. The IANA transition took 2 years to put together, and there was a deadline that we had to meet. If we try to do something like that outside of that context of having a deadline, it'll probably never get done. And one of the reasons for that, and there's a balance, I think, between you need the set of documents that you produce to be accepted as legitimate, and one of the ways you do that is through diversity. But as you get more and more diverse, everything gets more and more complicated, because even the meaning of the word, such as interesting, can become very different to people from very different cultures, and then the pace of your work becomes very, very slow.
Thanks, Jay. That was interesting. Okay. Tatiana.
Well, it is hard for me to conclude in the context of this session, because there are too many aspects of cybersecurity, even if you talk about best practices or good practices or whatever you name them. So I believe that my suggestion for good practices or best practices would be to start with the understanding what we mean when we talk about cybersecurity, which domains we mean, and where actually multi-stakeholder model will work and where not. Thanks.
I'm not sure what is the right answer for trade, because the times are changed now. So, and we are in transition, and I think next year will be a transition period for us in terms of trade, and then now the trade negotiations and trade agreements will be changed, because there is a strong political will in the US to go for bilateral route, not the international or plurilateral. So, but there are lessons to draw from the TPP and the defeat of the TPP. There are also, like, you know, in terms of trade, trade negotiations, it didn't start multi-stakeholder because this trade model was set up like in 1940s, and the countries were only talking about tariffs at that time. Now the trade negotiations involve lots of other issues, like, so the trade agreements involve like lots of issues like which affect everyone's life. So that was the case in the TPP. That's why people became really, really concerned about it. And businesses, big businesses, somehow found their way into the negotiations, but not necessarily small businesses. So we're in a transition period now, and the future doesn't seem that bright. But I still believe that, like, you know, if we can come up together, discuss, form coalitions, you know, we might be changing something. We'll see.
Yeah, thanks, Rafiq. It's a great question. I think it's one that we've struggled with for a while now as well. I mean, since Net Mundial, you know, where there was probably the best detailing of what those characteristics are for multi-stakeholders. And I'm not sure we've actually made much progress. I know there have been various efforts and indeed some dynamic coalitions to address some of these issues. But I think we really do need to think about what is the purpose of it rather than trying to figure out what are we going to call it, right? I mean, the purpose at the end of the day is to have decisions that are well informed, hopefully through people who have the expertise to bring to the table, that are holistic, that reflect the interests of stakeholders. And that doesn't mean it has to be every stakeholder. So we just have to be really careful about how we talk about what these characteristics or principles are, because the way we define them could in and of themselves be limiting. So while it's nice to think we can have a template or we can have something that actually we can point to and say, this is multi-stakeholderism, I would suggest that we need to really be cautious about doing that, because I don't think there is a model. And I think the reason why we talk about it's a mistake to talk about the multi-stakeholder model. There are variations, there are permutations, and I'm sure as we continue to evolve in this IG space, there'll be other variations and possibly other types of isms and models as well. So it is a nice idea. They're out there already. Let's not think about creating more. Let's see if we can actually implement them. But let's, at the end of the day, figure out what are we doing this for. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I don't think we are trying to set up the multi-stakeholder church here, but we acknowledge the diversity. So.
Can I comment on what I found quite interesting is what Matt said before. He said, we build, whether we liked it or not, the ability to work together. So it's something that happened throughout the process. So it wasn't predictable for all the participants before that it would turn out like that. And I think the same is true for this period of Net Mundial, and probably also for WCAG through the WSIS process. When we look back, we can identify certain moments where it seemed to work. And what worked there is that hierarchy was less important than the expertise brought to the table, so that people took each other serious and benefited from what the others could contribute. And we are not able to figure out what the conditions are for these few moments where it works. So it's important to keep asking ourselves, but also be aware that it's more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, it's really hard to... There we go. Yeah, it's really hard to answer that. I already tried to approach to that in my previous comment, and yeah, I believe the situation is quite satisfactory, and there are some happy exceptions. And I believe I already said about where I think the evolution has to go, and I hope there are many happy exceptions in the future. I believe in the next 4 or 5 years. I don't know. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Andres. I mean, yes, I think that's the end. And I want to thank everyone that stayed till now. It's always hard to compete with lunchtime, but thanks your dedication to keep academic this session. Thanks again, and hopefully see you after this. Okay, bye.